Once upon a time, in the charming village of Meadowbrook, there lived two vastly different men, Mr. Harold Humphrey, the richest man in the village, and Mr. Jim Jenkins, who was known not for his wealth, but for his warm smile and big heart. Mr. Humphrey lived in the grandest mansion at the hilltop, surrounded by manicured gardens and sparkling fountains. His days were filled with counting coins and planning for more riches. He wore the finest silk suits and traveled in a horse-drawn carriage made of the finest woods. However, despite all his riches, he was often seen with a frown on his face and very little laughter in his heart. Mr. Jenkins, on the other hand, lived in a small, cozy cottage at the edge of the woods. His roof was patched with straw, and his clothes were simple and worn. His home was always filled with joy, music, and laughter. He worked as a woodcutter, and though he earned not much, he had enough to share a loaf of bread and a cup of soup with anyone in need. One winter evening, a terrible storm struck the village. The icy winds howled and the snow piled high against doors and windows. All the villagers stayed indoors to keep warm. Mr. Jenkins, worried about the little birds that he often fed crumbs to, decided to brave the storm. He put on his thickest coat, grabbed a sack of grains, and trudged through the snow to scatter food for the hungry birds. Meanwhile, Mr. Humphrey sat by his grand fireplace, sipping hot cocoa while counting his gold coins. He heard the howling of the wind and the clattering of the windows, but chose to stay where it was warm and dry. His only concern was his wealth, and he had no thought to spare for the outside world. The next morning, the storm had passed, and a beautiful blanket of white covered Meadowbrook. As Mr. Jenkins walked through the village to check on his neighbors, he noticed something strange in Mr. Humphrey's garden. A large oak tree had fallen, smashing one of the enormous fountains. Mr. Jenkins rushed to help, and with the help of the other villagers, they managed to clear away the tree. Mr. Humphrey stood aside, taken aback by the act of kindness from villagers he barely spoke to. Seeing the community coming together made Mr. Humphrey realize that despite his wealth, he was poor in companionship and joy. He extended his thanks and offered to throw a grand feast in his mansion for everyone in the village. From that day on, Mr. Humphrey opened his heart and home, often joining Mr. Jenkins in helping others. And so, in Meadowbrook, wealth was not measured in coins, but in the warmth of friendships and shared laughter.